We are delighted to welcome two outsiders. There's a new book which has just come out, Against Public Broadcasting, and this puts forward the case why and how the ABC should be sold off. To join us is one of the two authors of the book. He's an economist at RMIT University. He's a senior research fellow at the Institute of Public Affairs. He runs the Catalaxy blog, which I urge you to read. He and Chris Berg, also from RMIT University, have just published this book. Welcome to Outsiders, Sinclair Davidson.
Good morning. How are you?
Very well, Sinclair. Talk us through your theories.
Well, the ABC is a billion-dollar government program that intervenes in the economy. And Chris and I have got a bit of experience at looking at government programs, so we thought, well, let's actually have a look at the ABC as a government program and not as some sort of cultural icon that everybody thinks is beyond criticism and beyond repute. So we had a look at all the arguments for it, against it, and we more or less came to the conclusion that a lot of the arguments in favour of the ABC existing as a government program don't really stack up. Or conversely, a lot of the arguments we can actually do for a lot cheaper. So the issue then is, why do we as taxpayers hand over $1 billion year after year after year to fund a government program that isn't actually fit for purpose? And then we thought, well, OK, what are we going to do with the ABC? And of course, there are a lot of people on the centre-right who think to themselves, well, shut it down, fire them all. While I do have some sort of sympathy for that on an ideological basis, the fact is the ABC is probably quite valuable. And so the issue then is how to realise that value. And part of the problem with the Liberal Party is they don't think it's valuable at all. So we used to have Joe Hockey answering questions like, why do we have the ABC? Do we get value for money? And all he could say was, well, some of my constituents watch the ABC. Now, that is no basis for a government program. Anyway, and so Chris and I are now thinking, well, how could we dispose of the ABC and actually realise some value for taxpayers? Now, we can list it on the stock exchange like they did with Qantas and the Commonwealth Bank. We could give it to the Future Fund, but that's just giving it to public servants, which is a bad idea. We could sell it to a mogul. I mean, could you imagine selling the ABC as a going concern to Gina Rinehart? I mean, that would be magnificent, but probably not viable. So we kind of thought, well, let's give it away. Now, we can give it away to the population at large, but then, of course, the insiders at the ABC would still have total control over the organisation and could still treat us with the contempt that which they currently treat us. So we thought, well, let's actually give it to those insiders, the current staff, employees, past employees of the ABC. These are the people who best know the organisation. These are the people who best think it's valuable, and let them realise the value of the ABC. And, of course, just give them the shares for nothing, and when they sell their shares, if it's valuable, they pay capital gains tax. So the government actually does get the money back. It just doesn't get the money back now. And so it's not a sugar hit to the budget, but the government will get the money back through the capital gains tax. And in the meantime, the taxpayers, the long-suffering taxpayers, save $1 billion a year. So this is win-win for everybody.
And presumably, Professor Davidson, if the people who work and control the ABC have a financial stake, literally, in its success, in its ratings, in its success, they will suddenly realise that there is perhaps a better purpose to be put to their talents than just flogging the Green left agenda.
Well, they would actually have to go out and find a market for their ideas. They would actually have to pay attention to the values of ordinary people who might want to watch the ABC. They would actually have to go out and find people who are prepared to pay for what it is that they offer, as opposed to forcing the rest of us to pay for it. I mean, it boils down to they would have to put their own money where their mouths are and not our money where their mouths are.
Ross?
Yeah, well, I'm addressed a little bit provocatively. I just want to make it clear, while my T-shirt says sack them all, that would basically be my policy. But not because I bear a flicker of animus towards the individuals working for the ABC, but because I just don't believe in the case for public broadcasting in 2018. I just don't think it makes sense. And so not only, as you say, Sinclair, do we bear the $1 billion cash cost, which is small beer, compared to the much wider cultural price we pay for this central engine of communication, which is completely statist, which is a creature of the state, which is owned by the state, which has one customer, which is the state, and which behaves as if it is indeed has only, you know, one customer and one viewer. And I just don't think Australia can afford that. But I say to you, Sinclair Davidson is a guiding spiritual light, along with Judith Sloan, Steve Cates, a few others, Dimitri Burstein, a friend also of the show, of Catalaxy Files, which I just want to say to our audience, you ought to get on and have a look at catalaxyfiles.org, I think is where you find it. It is the... .com, my apologies. It is, in terms of rational economic thought, it is the wellspring in Australia, and Sinclair is the absolute engine room. I have been attracted to this idea of yours, a way of getting this albatross off from around our necks by doing a Trump, what I would call a Trump-style deal. And that is to, in effect, sell it to those currently operating it. Just talk us through, you touched on it, just explain that deal to us, and what's something that the ABC staff might even be willing to support.
Well, Australia has a capital gains tax. So every single time you buy and sell an asset, the government is standing there with their hand out trying to take some of the money that you've really earned off your own risk capital. Now, I don't want to fire anybody at the ABC, and I'm quite sure most of us don't want to fire people at the ABC, but we don't really know who to fire. So when the government puts in an efficiency dividend, they're kind of saying, well, we don't want to tell you what to do, you decide. But of course, that's lazy policy. What we need to say to the ABC people is, you actually know what is valuable and what isn't valuable. Now, it may well be that they just shut it down themselves, but you would actually have people at the ABC firing themselves or even expanding if they could find somebody prepared to pay for it. But they would get the shares, and over time they would add value, or not, as the case may be. But let's imagine they make it more valuable. And then at some point you want to retire, you need money for something, you want to go on holidays, you sell your shares like everybody else does, and at that point the government is standing with their hand out. Now, of course, they got it for free, so the difference between the value that they create in the ABC and what they got it for, zero, is taxable. And of course they would then get the 50% individual tax discount, which the Howard government brought in, and good on them. And at that point, the ABC employees would only pay for the ABC after they've created value. Now, this is exactly how we finance higher education in Australia. We say to people, go to uni, we will stump you up front, and if you benefit from it and earn the money, you pay us back. Well, it's exactly the same deal as it is for the ABC staff. So if this funding arrangement is good for uni students, it's good for ABC staff too. They could actually fully benefit from the value they create. At the same time, if they simply think that let's just liquidate the company, sell it down, flog off all the assets, fire ourselves, of course there would be some value there, which of course again the government would realise through the capital gains tax. I'm actually thinking if this were ever adopted, we would actually have the ABC staff campaigning against capital gains tax. Now, to be quite honest, if that's what it takes to get rid of the capital gains tax, that is good money well spent as well.
There has never been a new tax which the ABC didn't love. You know, the ABC News loves new taxes as much as they dislike Chinese and Russians. But can I say, Sinclair, there are, of course, other countries around the world, in terms of the argument for a public broadcaster. I mean, some of the most despotic nations in the world intensely subsidise public broadcasting. There's no necessary democratic merit in having a tax-funded broadcaster.
No, to the contrary, the academic evidence tends to show that countries that are more likely to have public broadcasters tend to propagandise to their citizens. It just so happens that our public broadcaster propagandizes from a particular viewpoint of the world. I mean, as you pointed out, and Chris and I write about in the book, the ABC employees are 5 times more likely to be Greens voters than the general population. Now, there's nothing wrong with being a Greens voter if that's what you want, but that kind of suggests that they are incredibly out of touch with ordinary Australians. The whole idea that we have is that, well, journos tend to be kind of centre-left anyway, so what do you expect? Well, we're not talking centre-left here. We're actually talking very hard left-wing views here. And to be quite honest, the hard left view the rest of us with contempt. I mean, they genuinely can't tell the difference between mass murderers in Scandinavia and News Limited journalists. They genuinely think that they are the same sort of thing. So it's not surprising that we see I want to say the casual bias, the institutionalized bias, the bias that comes out of the ABC is what it is because they genuinely believe a very warped and distorted view of the world to be true.
Just tell us, Sinclair, very briefly, you go into the history of the ABC, the 1930s when it began, and its values and its charter and so on, and how different it is now. The argument is always, oh, well, you know, we've needed it since the 1930s. What did you find, you and Chris, in your research?
The 1930s was an era of media scarcity, and also people were looking to the United States and they saw a lot of disorder and chaos and anarchy, and they were kind of thinking, well, we don't actually want to have that here. We want to have a broadcasting system that educates, that informs, that is paternalistic, that tells people how to live their lives. And so in an era of great shortage, when there was almost no media, they also had to come up with ways of how to pay for it. And so there were all these schemes about paying for media, which in those days was technologically impossible, which today becomes technologically possible through decoders and the model at Sky News, for example, works where people pay for what they want. That wasn't possible in the 1930s, and so there was a plausible argument for some government intervention into the market. But of course, the ABC very quickly ingratiated itself into the Australian psyche, where everybody knows of it, but very few people actually watch it. And so you get to a situation where 80 years down the track, there hasn't been any really serious thought about the ABC, what it does, what it should be doing. And so what Chris and I have done is provided an evolutionary story about where it comes from, where it's going, how we got here. We've actually done a serious academic analysis of a very large government policy, and we're actually hoping that people will look at it as a serious academic analysis of the ABC itself, and then we've come up with some ideas as to what to do next. I think the Liberal Party notion of just simply changing the charter to include fair and balanced is a complete waste of time. What we need to do is make the charter, in the very first instance, enforceable at law. It's written in legislation, but the last bit actually says, and you can't enforce this in a court of law. Well, obviously the ABC will do what it's likes because there is no incentive for it not to do what it likes. And as a bureaucracy, as all bureaucracies are, it's captured by its staff, who we know are mostly hardcore left-wing voters. So it's not surprising we see what we get.